Hi, my name is Deirdre Mason. I am with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, and I want to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on leveraging Clean Water Act 319 and Safe Drinking Water Act programs for surface and groundwater quality planning. For those of you who don't know who ASWA is, our members are the Drinking Water Program Administrators for the 50 states, territories, the Navajo Nation, and the District of Columbia, and they regulate and provide technical assistance and funding for public water systems. They also coordinate with multiple partners to prioritize and support source water protection. The purpose of today's webinar is to build on the efforts of ASWA, ACWA, GWPC, and EPA, that's the Association of Clean Water Administrators, the Groundwater, and the Groundwater Protection Council, to share and promote Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act coordination activities across state and EPA water programs, and to share state examples where these programs are working together to protect watersheds and drinking water sources. So just a little bit of a history about our efforts between the three organizations and EPA. Back in 2014, we developed a Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act toolkit that provides a list and examples of desired outcomes and opportunities under each provision of the Clean Water Act to protect drinking water sources. We did a series of webinars on We also have been working with the Source Water Collaborative, which is a group of 27 agencies and organizations that work to protect drinking water on a number of efforts at the local level to engage those partners in the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act activities at the state level. And then we also conducted a workshop back in March of 2017, earlier this year, and we had our last webinar in August, and today is our second one. And you can find all of this information on ASWA's website. So for today's webinar, our presenters are from the Nevada Source Water Protection and Non-Point Source Program. We have Kim Borgziner and Birgit Henson. And from the state of Nebraska and EPA Region 7, we have Ryan Chapman and Heather Duncan. Please note that a video recording of today's webinar will be made available for viewing on ASWA's website within the next few days. And we would ask you to please type in your questions during the webinar in the control panel. We will not be taking verbal questions, and you may type your questions in at any time during the webinar. And we'll answer all of the questions at the end after all of the presenters are finished speaking. So with that, let me introduce Kim Borgziner and Birgit Henson. Are you ready to go?
We are ready. Thank you, Deirdre. Can everybody hear us okay?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, good morning. So my name is Kim Borgziner, and I am the Source Water Protection Coordinator for the state of Nevada. So I manage the implementation of what used to be called the State Wellhead Protection Program that has evolved into what we call now the Integrated Source Water Protection Program. And I'll be talking a little bit about that, but before I do that, I want to introduce Birgit Henson.
Good morning. I'm Birgit Henson, and I am in the Bureau of Water Quality Planning at Nevada Division of Environmental Protection. I oversee the Nevada Non-Point Source Management Program, and I know most of the folks on the call today are drinking water, and I am sure you know a lot about Clean Water Act as well, but this is under Section 319H of the Clean Water Act to restore and remediate any impacts to our impaired waters due to non-point sources.
And so Birgit and I have been working together for a few years now. And before we get into that, I just wanted to give a brief overview, and you can go to the next slide, a brief overview of our two different programs. And so source water protection is basically the protection of public drinking water sources. So that's groundwater wells, surface water intake, springs, and to help communities plan and really institutionalize the protection of their drinking water sources before they enter the drinking water system, the public water system, and assist the communities to develop and implement local source water protection plans. And what that entails is identifying and inventorying their intakes, their wells, their drinking water sources, and delineating protection areas around them and deciding as a community how they want to manage those areas to protect them and prevent contamination of those drinking water supplies.
And again, this is Birgit. The Nevada Non-Point Source Management Program, we actually were given revised guidance from EPA just a few years ago, those who may be familiar with that program. And so we rewrote our Nevada Non-Point Source Management Plan in 2015. And our main goals are to reduce non-point source and impaired waters by supporting non-point source reduction activities, including and especially the development and implementation of watershed-based implementation plans. We also focus on educating and informing the public on how they can reduce non-point source pollution, and we also focus very strongly on coordination with state, federal, and local agencies, including tribes, to implement non-point source reduction and prevention activities.
Next. So this next slide is a really interesting puzzle piece that we put together. We were trying to figure out here in Nevada how to put together and correlate and build bridges to our different programs under the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so we had envisioned that source water protection from the drinking water side could be a bridge to the different programs. Since they're all basically water quality protection programs or dealing with cleanup of water quality, we really felt like source water protection offered an opportunity for us to see where at the state level we could integrate these programs more and support our programs more, see where the overlaps are, and also to integrate what the local communities are doing in their planning to see how we could better support that at the state level when we do work with them on those challenges. Next.
And again, as I mentioned previously, we just recently revised our non-point source management plan. At the time, resources were becoming less, as we all are aware, and we've been encouraged both nationally and within our state programs to start looking at leveraging opportunities. And those of you familiar with the non-point source management side of things, it's a non-regulatory program. We're talking about anything that's not regulated through NPDES. So we're not talking about point sources coming from a pipe. We're not talking about regulating the loads from wastewater treatment plants. We are looking specifically at non-regulated, non-point source pollution. We receive a certain amount of money, as many of the states who have primacy programs for non-point source do, from EPA, that we can pass through for subgrants to different agencies and nonprofits who actually implement a lot of the work to do non-point source restoration and prevention. And the focus increasingly is on measurable load reduction in our Nevada waterways and the development and implementation of watershed management plans. Next.
So with that, there's a little background in how each of our programs are somewhat different under the different legislative acts that govern us. And so Birgit and I have been talking over the last couple years as these programs have developed and changed and shifted over time in how we could put our programs together. How can we take overlapping components of our two different programs and really make that work for our local communities? And having the two grant programs in separate bureaus and actually having them implemented somewhat differently proved to be very valuable to us. And so under the Integrated Source Water Protection Grant Program, we actually contract directly with the technical assistance provider to implement our grant program. So they get all the money from the grant and they go out and they help the local communities, but they're directly contracted with NDP. And our grant program focus is really to get the communities to institutionalize protection of drinking water resources through their local planning processes, education and outreach, and the development and implementation of these source water protection plans.
And again, from the non-point source side, historically, we have released an annual request for proposals. We have a technical review committee that reviews those proposals. And unlike source water programs, we actually can only contract with nonprofits and other agencies or quasi-regulatory groups. And therefore, having the freedom, as we talked about how we were going to join together, that the source water program had a technical assistance provider, really opened up some new ideas of how we might be able to coordinate.
Okay.
So a little background and to review a little bit more about Kim and I, just to let you know how this really happened. We've actually been friends for quite a while, and Kim's source water protection program was recently moved into a different bureau, and we were placed literally across the aisle, and I know that's usually a term used in political speak about reaching across the aisle, but we are very close as far as our working locations now, and it facilitated a lot of these early conversations about how to make this more of one water type of approach. Obviously, even though we have our boundaries based on our legislative backgrounds and our programmatic backgrounds and being in different bureaus, how can we really make this work? And of course, as I had mentioned, we had written this into our state non-point source management plan that we would coordinate with the Integrated Source Water Protection Program, and we had action items that we delineated. We weren't sure what that looked like in the beginning, other than just going to each other's meetings, talking about what this might look like, integrating some ideas about source water protection into non-point source grants and that sort of thing. Around the same time, the state EPA Collaborative Toolkit that was mentioned earlier came out, and we poured through this and really tried to look at how other states and other programs integrated their different water programs. And we found some good examples, and we thought, okay, yeah, this is being done in other areas. This is a great way to leverage our resources, and we could have a lot more impact if we're looking at regional water management programming and not creating these boundaries that have really, in my mind, been created by how the legislation was written. And the end product that we're really looking for and we're working on is this comprehensive source water and watershed management plan. Next. So of course, as we all do, we have many guidance documents that we need to look to and make sure that we're meeting all of our state, federal, local requirements, and we're not thinking too far out of the box or crossing too many lines. And of course, a lot of those, as you all know, are fiduciary requirements of who can pay for what. And as I mentioned before, non-point source is non-regulatory. We cannot pay for anything that is related to permit requirements and NPDES requirements, that sort of thing. And so we look to the guidance documents such as the Office of Water, EPA's National Water Program Guidance for 2016-17, our internal documents, as I mentioned, the non-point source management plan just recently approved. It's a 5-year plan. The Integrated Source Water Protection Program, which Kim did mention, was quite a bit streamlined and changed through her direction a few years ago to be more comprehensive and integrative of different water, looking at different water programs. And of course, the handbook for developing watershed plans to restore and protect waters, which is also an EPA document. Next.
So as Birgit and I have been working through this, one of the things that we really had to decide with the effort that we were making is what are the real benefits of bringing these together? Because as we move towards looking at approaching the communities that we wanted to approach to participate in this larger, grander planning process, what were the benefits? And not only for the state, but also for the local communities. And so some of those just jumped right out at us. Obviously, the comprehensive water quality planning, bringing the surface water and groundwater components together is a huge benefit to the local communities, and especially those that rely on both groundwater and surface water together for a drinking water source. Prioritized and fundable projects, opening up 2 grant programs together enables the communities to really tap into and be guided through a process that helps them to prioritize and have access to the funding for the projects that they want to get done. One of the big benefits that we have found in the last year is the more invested and influential stakeholder groups, and this is huge. This is really one of the strengths of this approach, is we have brought groups together that sometimes may not always interface or interact, and having a larger stakeholder group that is invested in watershed management as well as drinking water protection gives us that clout. It really brings more investment into the planning process, and it's more digestible by the local governing boards, who we will eventually bring it to and move the planning effort forward. And the regional collaborative planning approach, it's really interesting when historically we worked on this. You go into different communities and there's little pockets of water systems that we initially have worked with. So you would have some water systems protected under a wellhead protection plan in a community and others not, yet they're all in the shared aquifer. And the regional collaborative approach really helps us nail down getting every public water system in an area, in a jurisdictional area, together, and really coordinating with the watershed folks and piggybacking in many cases on what the watershed folks are doing in the framework they already have in place. So this has been a huge benefit. And an efficient and focused use of funding. This has been big for me in my program particularly, is we're able to focus more funding over a longer period of time into a specific community to help really to help them develop and then move into implementation as well. So that efficient use of and focus of funding gives us a little bit of a hand-holding edge where we can really move them through and ensure that plans aren't just sitting on the shelf, but they're also getting implemented and projects are getting done. Next. So Birgit and I had an opportunity. Where do we start? The way that my contract works for source water protection is we have a competitive process every 4 years where contractors come and they propose what communities they want to work in, and they demonstrate to us why they are the right contractor with not only the qualifications but the relationships developed to be successful in the communities that we're looking at. We have 17 counties and have completed comprehensive county-wide source water protection plans in 7 of those counties. And our contractor that we currently selected had proposed to do this work in Washoe County. And it was one of the ones that was on our radar for several reasons that will become apparent as we move through the presentation. So this was a perfect opportunity for our 2 programs to come together because, in particular, Truckee Meadows depends on the Truckee River for most of their drinking water. But there are also public water systems throughout that area that are on groundwater wells. So this was a great start for us to really try to see if we could bring the 2 programs together. Next.
So as Kim was focusing on, she went through her contracting process, which is different than the non-point source in Nevada, and she selected her contractor and looked at Washoe County. It was very interesting because the Truckee River watershed, and of course I look at things from a watershed perspective, and sometimes I forget about the parts of the county that are outside, and Kim's looking at a county perspective, so that's one way that our programs have been different. But it was very exciting for me because we had started a planning process through some nonprofits looking at the main stem of the Truckee River through Reno and Sparks. And any of you who are familiar with the Arid West, this is actually a terminal basin. It starts up at Lake Tahoe. Truckee River flows through California, through the river, the cities of Reno and Sparks, into tribal lands to the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, and terminates in Pyramid Lake. It's a very interesting watershed. Any of you who are into water rights out here in the West will know it as pretty much where water rights in the West were delineated. It's also interesting from a surface water perspective, not just based on its geography and all of the different jurisdictions that we're working with, but it is listed and there is a TMDL for total nitrogen, phosphorus, and TDS that NDEP put out in 1994. It's also been prioritized through other activities that some of you on the call may be familiar with. We've been prioritizing our listings, and it's on the Nevada 303D list and been prioritized for temperature and turbidity in different parts of the Truckee River and tributaries. So as far as from the non-point source and the Surface Water Clean Water Act perspective, this is a very intriguing area, and there were other planning efforts that were starting up, looking at some of our homeless issues along the main stem of the river through the middle of town that were concerns for our water purveyors as far as what was being contributed for pollutants. This might be a good time to mention, I know that Kim's going to talk about it a little bit in a moment, that the majority of drinking water for this area and the Reno-Sparks population is actually surface water. So there were a lot of components that came together that looked like, wow, this is a great pilot project for us to coordinate these two programs. Next.
So just a real quick overview of what this area looks like. Washoe County, the Truckee Meadows, has a population of 400,000 plus people. Both groundwater and surface water are used as primary drinking water sources. For the larger population, as Birgit said, the Truckee River watershed, the Truckee River is the main source of drinking water. But there are another 91 regulated public water systems with 248 wells in the area that are used for drinking water. So this is a combination of a real effort to look at how do we come together and protect both groundwater and surface water as their main drinking water resource. Next.
We stuck this in here because we weren't sure how many of you have seen the beautiful Truckee River, and this is a picture of it as it flows through Reno. And you'll notice it actually has been highly modified through the cities. This is as it's coming through downtown Reno. There was a whitewater park put in there, so this is a very active area for recreation, contact recreation. There are multiple beneficial uses that the Truckee River supports that we are looking at protecting through joining these watershed management planning efforts. Next.
Okay, so here's where we really get into the meat of looking at how this community is structured and how do we really get into understanding how this planning effort fits into their local planning structure. And in that community, there's the Truckee Meadows Regional Planning Agency that is the regional driver for master planning in the community for the three different agencies, Sparks, Reno, and Washoe County. And there's also a created comprehensive water regional, it's the WRWC, Western Regional Water Commission, if I said that right. And they are responsible for water management in Washoe County and the Truckee Meadows. And so as we were looking at this, we realized that many of these plans were in the process of or had recently been updated. And we started to look at whether these plans had actually addressed non-point source and source water protection. And some of them had, in their goals, mentioned this as a component of their planning. But it was a little simple, and we wanted to figure out how to play on this, how to really piggyback on their master planning documents and ensure that the goals were in place so that we could be successful in this planning effort and the community would support this planning effort. Next. So the WRWC recently updated their comprehensive regional water management plan, and this plan actually has extensive goals and action items that relate to source water protection and non-point source protection. So that was really a good thing for our planning effort, for us to be able to go before the boards and say, this is in direct support of your regional water management plan. Next. The three agencies, Reno, Sparks, and Washoe County, the Reno and Sparks comprehensive master plans had recently gone under some updates, and those also included the the source water protection and non-point source components. The Washoe County plan is planned for update in the near future, and so we're looking forward to also ensuring that that plan has the same elements. Next.
So as you've heard, there were multiple different planning efforts going on. It seemed like, I actually said in several of our presentations to local boards looking for support of this effort, it was like the perfect storm. All of these different planning efforts were coming together. It just seemed like a perfect time to really look at this at a regional scale. There's many moving parts here. As you can imagine, it's pretty political. And some of these efforts were well coordinated with others, and some not so much. So we were trying to make sure that it was really open, transparent, and fully coordinated between these three jurisdictions, 2 states, and a tribe at the terminus of this watershed. Also, there's many overlapping goals, and how can we get to those big picture items that everyone could get on board with? Next slide. So this is just one of our little representations that we would take to the local boards when asking for support for this effort. How do we get out of our respective boxes, or here the really representative circles, and be able to work together, overcome our either perceived or real boundaries, find aligned goals, and do a coordinated regional water quality effort. Next slide. And we found one thing overall. We found that people kept saying, no matter whether they were with a city, a county, a smaller regional entity, they said, what we really want is to have the information so that we can implement projects. We need money. We need to be able to implement these projects. In a lot of cases, we know what needs to be done. We need data to support that, and we need money. And so we looked at that and thought, okay, so if that's what the community needs, that feeds into the non-point source program as far as how we can fund implementation of those projects. However, we do need this EPA-approved watershed management plan with the 9 elements. How do we make sure that those things are integrated so we get EPA approval from the non-point source side? And then as far as the integrated source water protection program, how do we get this plan to meet those needs as well in order to end up with a county-wide plan to protect drinking water sources as well? Next slide.
So Birgit and I really started thinking about how this would all look and how it would come together and what we wanted from this planning initiative. Next slide. And ultimately, we want success. Everybody wants success, but what does that look like? For us, success looks like we wanted a real community commitment. We wanted a stakeholder group that was really bought into this process. We needed local champions. We wanted it to be something that they could own and call their own. And it being a voluntary program makes it easier for them to digest. So we're not coming in and telling them that they have to do something. We're coming in and telling them all the benefits of a combined planning effort. And our emphasis was really on the stakeholder group development, really relationship building, really driving home. We spend a lot of upfront time in our technical assistance contract under Source Water Protection with stakeholder building. Much of the time that we spend in communities is many upfront meetings, discussions, talking about what the program is, what the program isn't, and how we can come together in a stakeholder-driven process to help them own their plan and drive the success of the program. Next. So program integration, as Birgit and I were brainstorming this process, we had multiple things that we had to discuss and really hash out. And like Birgit had mentioned before, she and I had been discussing this stuff for about a year prior to even approaching the communities, so that we would have our ducks in a row when these questions came up. So the funding and technical assistance, what was that going to look like? And we had the ability to use a technical assistance provider to start initiating stakeholder development until the rest of the funding can come through the process of the non-point source funding acquisition process. Stakeholder team development, what was that going to look like? Who are we going to bring on board? How are we going to bring people from 2 different programs, from 2 different frameworks together so that we could have a unified front in how we want to move forward with regional water quality protection and planning? Local participation. How do we get the local boards on board? How do we maintain and keep it a stakeholder-driven process without prescribing to the community how we think it should go? So we had to be open to understanding what their needs were and how they really want to drive this process, what their challenges and constraints might be. Developing a framework for one plan to meet both program requirements. for that to be realistic and implementable, integrated into different programs, different city agendas, county, different agencies, and as well as state, and sustainable into the future. Not a plan that sits on the shelf, but a plan that can really be picked up and used. And how do we prioritize these fundable projects at the end of this process? Next. So, as a part of the process that we have, we are fortunate that we have an upfront technical assistance provider, and our current technical assistance provider is Resource Concepts, Inc. Fabulous, fabulous local contractor, consulting firm who facilitates essentially for source water protection all aspects of planning. They, from the team building components to plan development to actually helping us prioritize projects and implement and get funding to the public water systems and the agencies that need the funding for source water protection implementation. Having a contractor to be able to facilitate this process has been key to our success in building our stakeholder group, in the sense that it's upfront funding. It's the technical assistance is funding that we don't have to contract. We get to skip the contracting portion of this and allow the contractor to just step in, do the upfront stakeholder building and meeting facilitation, and do the presentations and coordination, and build the relationship. Like I said, relationship building has been the #1 focus at this point in time. And they also have the technical expertise to author the plan and coordinate the presentations and acceptance and approvals of the plan. And at the end, it's work with the communities and help us as a state agency who's not always on the ground understand where their priorities lie, what projects need to be funded that meets the needs of both the regulatory agency and DEP's hold and the local community's needs. And I put a website down at the bottom. RCI does a great job in keeping transparency at the forefront of this planning process, especially when you're dealing with the political differences and the political constraints that we work under. And they have developed a website that you can go to and look at that speaks to, basically houses our meeting minutes. It houses where we're focused, kind of where we're at in the meetings. It really is helpful to the communities to have all this information ready and available at the click of a button, so that they know exactly how to speak to where we are at in the program and where we're moving and how we're moving forward. Next.
So this is a slide with a whole lot of words. And I know you've heard a lot about how we've strategized, how we've worked on the process, and working my whole career, I'm a scientist, student, and engineer. People want to gather the data, do the analysis, write the plan, implement the plan. Well, if you're dealing with very difficult water rights and political issues, that's not always how it works. And so we've been taking the long approach to lead to long-term success implementation. Of course, the devil is in the details, and that's what this slide is really pointing to. This is the framework that we developed in coordination with RCI. How do we meet all of the needs for our political, those jurisdictions, for source water protection, and for non-point source? So we're making sure that we're checking all of our boxes. And not only that, how do we put ourselves on a reasonable time frame? So I know it's very small words, you probably can't see it, but this is really the steps of how we are moving through the process, correlated with the dates of how we're doing that. Next. And just real brief, and just to give you an idea, here's just a few of the partners that we're collaborating with. You've heard this, but a lot of moving parts, a lot of different entities. We're, of course, erring on the side of inclusion, not separating anyone else who might be someone who might not agree from the beginning. We want them on board from the beginning so that we figure out what those issues are from the start so we can move through them. Next slide. And in order to do so, we've been holding meetings with our core planning team, making sure that we are really looking to those folks that are going to have the big questions. Public works, flood management, public water systems, the federal land component out here in the West. A lot of our watersheds are held in federal land. How do we make sure that all of these different issues and all of these people's concerns about implementing such a program are being met? Next.
So So we'll go through these pretty quickly. I know we're running out of time. The local planning team role. As we've held regular team meetings over the past year and a half, about once every 6 to 8 weeks. And these team meetings up front have really been to share ideas, understand the data that we need to collect, identify other stakeholders, prioritize water quality issues and threats, and support plan adoption and implementation. It's really key to understand that the first year, even though I've been running this program for years and Birgit's been running her program for years, we kind of know the direction that we'd like to see it go. We know the elements of the plans. We know what our requirements are. The team members don't always necessarily understand that. So this first year is always a good year, not only for the development of the relationships, but to educate the team on how this is going to move forward, what we need to do, and what their role is. Next. And over the last 6 months, the team has come together to identify their must-haves in the plan. One of the first ones is regional support and approval. We all have agreed, the stakeholders have agreed, that without regional support and approval of the governing board, the plan is not likely going to have the same support for funding and prioritization. They want the plan to be coordinated and consistent with and complementary to the other plans, as we described in the other slides, looking at their master planning documents and their water management plan. This plan has to be consistent with those plans. Useful to funding and regulatory agencies, identifying water quality problems and solutions. It will include a list of prioritized implementable projects, and it should have a process outlined for implementation of the plan with roles and responsibilities for where tools will be housed, who will be doing what, and how that action plan will be implemented. And lastly, and this is a new one for me in source water protection, a process to show the benefits and accomplishments. And I think that relates to a measure of success. And that, I think, is more of a non-point source benefit. But it's one of those where we've been able at the source water protection to realize that benefit and yeah, we'll move forward with that. Next. So this is real quick, just a schedule. You'll see that we plan to have the plan completed in 2019 and go through the public review and local approval process by December of that year. So this will have been a 4-year planning initiative by the time that we're done with it. Next.
So more specifically, what exactly is this plan going to entail? What do we need at this point? And this is kind of where we're at right now. We talked a lot about how we strategized and built our stakeholders, but right now we're really in the gathering of information, doing a data gap analysis to figure out what information do we have, what information do we need to move forward. We are lucky in that the city of Reno actually created the Truckee River Information Gateway, which is an online data resource where a lot of the agencies are already sharing data to utilize. What are the existing wellhead protection areas? And what are watershed maps? And here's a picture of one of our teams out in actually the Allen Creek watershed, one of the tributaries to the Truckee River. And you'll notice behind our folks, it's a very turbid day up there in the watershed due to high snow and high runoff at that point. Next. We need to evaluate all of the contaminants in the watershed and in the county. What are our potential chemical spills, USTs? What's the urban slobber, the soil erosion? We have a lot of federal lands up in the higher watershed. What's going on in those forests as far as erosion into our tributaries? Next.
And strategy development. What are we going to do? This is where we decide after we've evaluated what our challenges are. What are we going to do? What coordinated planning needs to take place? What education efforts will we be looking at? Prioritization of projects. And really getting to the meat of what is going to work for this community and how they want the outcomes to look. Next.
And of course, this is the part that we're driving to get to that all of our stakeholders want to see. This is actually an example from Bell River in Michigan. One of our main stakeholder core group participants actually was involved in developing that watershed plan in Michigan. And what we're looking to do is create these project profiles for all of these different things that we want to implement, whether it's for source water, non-point source, or both. What's the funding, the schedule, milestones, load reductions related to those projects, implementation, and the monitoring for success. Next.
These are some examples of projects that we've done historically in other communities in Nevada that will probably come together under one plan. So for source water protection, we've done a lot of well inventory studies where we've looked at communities and decided in source water protection areas where there might be orphan, unused wells that present a direct threat to the aquifer. And we've actually funded quite a few of the closures of these wells. Wellhead security improvements, where we've, in smaller communities in Nevada, in rural Nevada, helping them with fencing, helping them with bollards. You can see in the front of this picture where the well house is just bollards that help to protect the wellhead itself and the security of the wellhead. Are examples of some of the projects that we might be looking at in this community.
Other examples from more the non-point source side: stream restoration, stormwater BMP implementation, upland erosion control. And here's a picture actually from the Carson River watershed of doing some willow work with local school kids, actually. Next.
Education outreach is a very comprehensive and well done activity in Washoe County. We have extensive education outreach programs. We've done this historically in many of our communities where we've implemented curriculum in schools that address source water protection and non-point source solutions. We do educate community leaders. We do outreach to businesses and training for emergency responders. And these are all things that will be considered and likely implemented in the action plan for this community as well. Next. And finally, almost second to last slide, public review and support. Probably one of the most important aspects of this planning effort is really ensuring that the local boards that we address review and support and approve these plans so that we can move forward with implementing them. Next.
So with that, if we have any questions, I know we went a little over. Dr. Peter would like to move us on, but thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, of course, you can contact us directly as well.
Yes, this is Deirdre, and we are going to hold all the questions till the end of the webinar. If you would just go ahead and continue to please type them in as you think of them. We'll run through them all at the end. So with that, we are going to move on to our next presenters, and that is Ryan Chapman and Heather Duncan from Nebraska and EPA Region 7. Ryan and Heather, are you ready to go?
I'm ready. So hello, my name is Ryan Chapman. I'm with the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality here in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm going to explain what we've done to combat non-point source pollution here in Nebraska, and specifically going to kind of focus on what we've done related to nitrates. I'm also going to describe how we're trying to fund those projects. When I'm done, Heather Duncan, who's my EPA Region 7 friend, is going to explain the structure of how we're able to do what we're going to do using the 319 funds, and how you could do something similar in your state. So to give you a bit of context, which in my opinion is significant to our success here in Nebraska, we have an extremely small 319 program and an even smaller source water protection and wellhead protection program. We have 1 FTE doing the source water wellhead protection work, and 5 FTEs, which are divided up amongst about 10 people doing the Section 319 non-point source projects. So we have lots of people that wear lots of different hats that kind of work together, working in multiple programs and crossing between both the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. We also have a rich history of undertaking groundwater projects with Clean Water Act money. We have lots of support politically and from the public for these groundwater related projects. Our division administrator is a geologist, and she's extremely passionate about groundwater and has firsthand experience with both wellhead protection and 319 programs. So one final comment, I'm just the messenger. We really work here as a team, and I want to give the entire team credit. Next slide. So here in Nebraska, we have 522 community public water supply systems that have their own source of water. If you're looking at the map there, the blue dots are groundwater-based systems. The orange dots are groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, and the red dots are surface water systems. The dot sizes also correspond to the size of the public water system, or I guess how many folks the water system serve. So the median community public water system in Nebraska serves roughly 300 individuals. So we have lots and lots of really small systems. And like the slide says, roughly 88% of the state's nearly 2 million residents drink groundwater. So we are predominantly small communities drinking groundwater. Next slide. Here in Nebraska, both the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act share a collective problem. That's nitrates in groundwater. Predominantly, we think those are from non-point sources. So looking at the map, you probably can't make out the legend too well. The blues and yellows are under the MCL of 10, oranges are above, and reds and purples are really bad. So you can see we have some areas there in the state, in the Platte River Valley is kind of that central southern area that has some bad areas, and then a spot there in the northeast that I'm going to talk about here shortly that we call the Bazille area. So the gridded squares that are shown in this map are actually townships, and they're showing the average of the most recently reported nitrate sample from the last 20 years, and that's nearly 20,000 wells that's shown there. Next slide. So we'll dive in a little bit to the Clean Water Act, Section 319, non-point source world, specifically here in Nebraska. The map shows active and in the works non-point source management plans. Technically, they're called 9-element watershed management plans, with the exception of the green rectangle that doesn't really look much like a watershed there in northeast Nebraska. And we call that one the Bazille Groundwater Management Area. So nationally, it's the first EPA accepted alternative to a 9-element watershed management plan. This was possible through the 2014 EPA guidance that Heather's going to talk about here after I'm done. So I have two more slides talking about this Bazille plan specifically, and then I'm going to explain our efforts to do the same thing on a much smaller scale relative to community public water supply systems. Next slide. So here's a blow up of that Bazille groundwater management area. I guess as blown up as you can get it. It's nearly 500,000 acres if you can read the total acres in that little chart there. For comparison, this area is approaching the size of Rhode Island. This Bazille area is 756 square miles, and Rhode Island, I just did a quick Google search, and it looks like it's about 1,045 square miles. So we're getting up there in size. And it encompasses parts of 3 counties, parts of 4 natural resources districts, and 8 community public water supply wellhead protection areas. In a few minutes, Heather's going to boil down the steps to a watershed management plan. One of those steps includes targeting areas for best management practice BMP implementation. The shaded colors there, the polygons on the map, show the priority areas that were targeted for BMPs in this Bazille groundwater management plan. If you want to take a look at the map there, Tier 1 and Tier 2 are public water supply systems wellhead protection areas. The pink shading there is the Tier 1, and that includes a 20-year time of travel for wellhead protection areas. The blue shading includes a 50-year time of travel for those 8 community public water supply systems. So the largest Tier 1 and 2 tier areas in the middle of the map, and maybe it's more in the northeast kind of middle there, but essentially in the middle there, is the community of Creighton. Creighton was put on an RO treatment system nearly 20 years ago to treat for nitrate. So they have a long history of nitrate, not only in Creighton, in that kind of middle area there, but throughout this entire area. And then over the years, 5 of these 8 public water supply systems have at one point in time been under administrative order for exceeding the nitrate MCL. And before I forget, if you're interested in seeing all 109 riveting pages of this Bazille plan, there's a link there at the bottom of the slide that if you download the deal afterwards, you should be able to click on that, and it'll get you to those pages. Have the next slide, please. So this Brazil plan really targets agricultural BMPs. A major challenge with the Brazil project was not only identifying best management practices for groundwater, but quantifying load reductions, or at least giving them specific ranges, I guess. And in this case, we're talking mostly about agricultural BMPs. It's a very agricultural area, tons of row crop farming there. And we had to justify water quantity BMPs, as this is mostly pivot irrigated agriculture. We also had to do some education through some peer-reviewed literature to try to explain how quantity can drive quality in a groundwater system such as this. So the Brazil Groundwater Management Plan was accepted by EPA almost exactly a year ago, and it took about 5 years to complete. In those 5 years that we were working on the Brazil plan, we continued to have community public water systems in other areas of the state here in Nebraska that experience nitrate issues similar to the communities included in this Brazil plan. So we got to thinking, how can we do this same thing on a different scale, focusing on individual community wellhead protection areas instead of a huge area such as Brazil here. Next slide. So that thinking led to the creation of what we're calling the Drinking Water Protection Management Plans. I apologize for the mouthful there, but we try to incorporate some 319 lingo in this and some source water protection lingo. But the funding of the planning end is we're doing it through the SRF 15% set aside. We'll get those reviewed and accepted by EPA as an alternative to that 9-element watershed management plan, and that then will open us up for Section 319 to the Section 319 money to help fund implementation, because 319 money now requires that alternative. It either requires a 9-element plan or the alternative to the 9-element plan. Next. So through our funding assistance agreements to community public water systems, we lay out our expectations, which they then pass along to their consultants. Generally, those expectations include meeting EPA's requirements for the alternative 9-element watershed management plan, includes modeling the wellhead protection area with a 3-dimensional model. Essentially, we're talking about mod flow in most cases, and expanding that out to the 50-year time of travel. Expect them to go through a community-based planning process. Expect them to plan a solid and implementable information and education program. And finally, we tell them that we are going to review their draft plan and that their consultant should plan for at least one round of edits before it's sent off to EPA for their thumbs up. Next slide. Here's an example of the 50-year wellhead protection area that was done by a consultant for us, actually for one of the communities using ModFlow. So expanding this out to the 50-year time of travel makes this particular wellhead protection area, and these lengths are pretty similar throughout the majority of the state, with a few exceptions there. But this makes it about 23 square miles. So the vast majority of our 522 community public water protection areas are modeled using WAM currently, and in the WAM process, that 2-dimensional model, we're only going out to the 20-year time of travel. So this was a bit of a stretch going out to that 50-year time of travel. We did that for several reasons. Reasons that we decided to go out to that 50-year, and a few of those are that groundwater systems change slowly. Oftentimes we're dealing with large vadosomes, some with years of time of travel just through the vadosome. Generally, we also had a scale issue, meaning that it doesn't make much sense to spend $50,000 on a plan that's only going to implement $100,000 of BMPs. So we wanted to make sure that if we were doing this planning, that it was going to be for the long term, that we're going to do it on a scale that makes sense, and that we were going to get some bang for our buck, I guess. And finally, the feedback from public water system operators saying that planning for only 20 years, and I'm quoting here, planning for 20 years is dumb. They claim, one even suggested that we should go out to 100 years. So we thought that the 50-year would be a good time of travel. Next slide. So we're just getting started with this pilot, we're doing it on 4 communities. All of these are located in southeast Nebraska, which are in the glaciated portion of Nebraska, typically more complicated hydrogeology than central and western Nebraska. They're also larger than most other systems, and 2 of them are under the direct influence of surface water. And we're doing this funding mechanism through an existing source water protection grant program that we've had set up for a number of years. Next slide. So Deirdre, here's your picture slide because you said to add some pictures. So similar to the Brazil plan, the BMPs being selected are chosen based on their potential loading reductions, and they're also being selected through that community-based planning process. So we're asking, you know, what does the public want and what are they willing to do from a volunteer standpoint, since this is all volunteer plans that's happening here. Next slide. So other endeavors, currently our wellhead protection coordinator and 319 coordinator are out in central Nebraska conducting a risk communication workshop. These are 2-day workshops that are focused on training local project coordinators and public administrators and governing bodies on how to effectively communicate their risks specific to nitrate in drinking water out to the public. Because for most folks, the problem is kind of one of those out of sight, out of mind problems. We want to figure out how do we best communicate, you know, the information that we have as scientists and as professionals that work with this every day. How do we get that out to the public in the most effective manner, and how do we actually get them to believe us? So that's kind of the goal of those workshops. We're currently funding the workshops through the Section 319 non-point source program money. So those risk communication workshops are part of our larger statewide nitrate outreach campaign that we've just begun to start about a year ago. The goal of this this campaign was to create a statewide plan to educate, inform, and coordinate messaging relating specifically to nitrate. We hope this will then lead to improved participation in projects like the Brazil plan and these drinking water management plans, like I was just describing. So before I turn this over to Heather, here's your cue to unmute your phone. I might suggest that this kind of last nitrate education would be a great topic, I think, for future webinars.
Thanks, Ryan. My name is Heather Duncan. I am with EPA Region 7's office in Kansas City. And out of our Kansas City office, we serve the states of Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri, as well as 9 tribal nations. And among my hats here in Region 7, I am the Nebraska State Liaison to the 319 program. And so I do want to take a little bit of time to explain how Nebraska has documented its approach to pursue groundwater protection projects with 319 funding. But before I do that, let me play bureaucrat a little bit and walk you through some of the foundation for what we'll be talking about. You know, as you've already heard from Nevada as well as Ryan in Nebraska, you know, the term the 319 program can refer to multiple scales and focal points. It can refer to the national scale, where EPA distributes congressional funding, provides program oversight, documents success stories. You can hear 319 referred to at the regional scale, where EPA is reviewing and approving annual grant work plans, serving as liaisons to the states on their programs and priorities. It can refer to the state scale, where each state develops its own priorities and program structure that align with EPA's national 319 guidelines. And then it does even trickle down to the watershed scale, where local watershed projects are planned and implemented. And so this slide here just basically gives you all of those citations in federal statute, as well as the citation for the non-point source program guidelines from EPA, just in case you're interested in digging into those. Since these national program links have been included in previous webinars, it's just good to remember they're out there. They remain an accurate resource for you if they're needed. Next slide, please. So the first thing that Nebraska did when they were interested in going down this road was to document source water and drinking water protection as a state priority. In the state of Nebraska, there is a long-standing state history of integrated water planning between groundwater and surface water. And they documented this priority from a 319 program standpoint in its state non-point source management program plan. Documenting that history in that plan emphasized the priority of these public health concerns and tied them to the environmental water quality conditions and the non-point source pollution that was causing them. Bureaucratically speaking, the non-point source management plan is the foundational component of a state's 319 program. The document is required by statute. It articulates the state's areas of program focus, the order of those program priorities, and how progress and success will be measured in each of those areas. And so once those priorities and measures are documented in the state's draft non-point source management plan, the EPA will review that plan and approve it. And once it's approved, the document is used by both the regional 319 program and the state 319 program to prioritize work for the next 5 years. Everything from what water to work in, which watersheds to work in, which pollutant to target, and what progress we would expect to be made with the limited amount of 319 funds that are available for each program. And so nationally speaking, the primary interest for these 319 efforts is water quality restoration. We want to delist impaired water bodies. That said, the National 319 guidelines do also allow for a negotiated number of projects to target protection of high quality water resources. And that balance, that negotiated priority, the relative priority between restoration and protection is also documented in the state's non-point source management plan. So this document is really foundational. In the case of Nebraska, they gave highest priority to restoration. The majority of Nebraska's 319 efforts are focused on improving conditions in impaired water bodies. And for those of you who are listening from outside the state of Nebraska, you may be interested. Most states will be updating their non-point source management plans sometime between now and 2020. Next slide, please. So, just as you heard with Nevada, Nebraska has developed watershed-based plans, also known as 9-element plans in the 319 world. The plans follow a fairly basic problem-solving logic. You start with the problem, you find the root causes, you identify the solutions to fix those root causes, and then you explain how long it's going to take to fix the problem. And so that logical process is demonstrated on this slide. This is how the logic looks in addressing surface water, which is usually the common route for 319. We look for the impaired water bodies, we find where the sources of that pollutant are, we find out where those targeted areas need to be to minimize those sources and reduce the impairment, what BMPs would do the fixing, how much load reduction we can get from them, all of that with the goal of removing that impairment from the water body. If surface water is used as source water, that surface water body usually has a drinking water supply use designation. And so this logic flow is fairly easy to follow. Where it gets tricky is when your source water is groundwater. Next slide, please. So translating this justification to groundwater was a bit nuanced, primarily because the Clean Water Act was written for surface water, and not all states designate uses for groundwater. So this slide demonstrates the framework that we've been using with the state of Nebraska for its work. The spirit of the 319 program is there. The logic still flows in the same common sense problem-solving direction. The distinction is making sure that we're documenting the scientific justification for why we're using non-point source reduction approaches to restore groundwater. As you're looking through this flow, we're distinguishing between restoration situations and protection situations, which you'll talk about in a minute. In order to be a restoration situation, we're basically saying that one or more of these things is occurring, that either degradation is still occurring, we're watching nitrate levels increase, or we're seeing high loads in that time of travel that will eventually reach that municipality and would start to cause concern. And so then we're going back and finding the sources. The sources in most cases are going to be at the surface, and this is where the justification starts to get tricky. The hardest part of the scientific argument is this vadose zone work. What portion of the issue is attributable to non-point source issues, pollution sources? What BMPs will help us increase infiltration, minimize leaching, is in essence decrease loading to the vadose zone, in order to remove that source water impairment, if you will, the drinking water, source water requiring treatment because it's being polluted by non-point source. The other piece of this, the part that Nebraska documented extremely well in their BZO plan, was documenting the potential cost savings from preventing impairments in waters where quality is declining. So kind of that balance between the cost of drinking water treatment or infrastructure upgrades versus the cost of BMPs to accomplish those same goals. Next slide, please. Now, while Nebraska isn't pursuing protection yet, we are in Region 7 sharing the state's anticipation that these groundwater restoration efforts will be successful and protection work might be necessary in sensitive areas in the future. And so we've started to think about what that justification would look like, and you'll notice it looks fairly similar to what it did for restoration. You're still starting with the quality of the source water. You're still identifying where those sources of non-point source pollution are affecting the quality of the source water. You know, the targeted areas where you're on the surface where you're going to do work in order to impact that plume, if you will, in the groundwater, what BMPs will get you there, the load reductions, and that all kind of plays out as to how long the plan will take. The other thing to consider is at what point in a protection plan, how much is enough? What is your end point for quality? Where is enough concentration decrease been seen so that work can stop and be targeted in other areas of your state that are in need of work? Next slide, please. And so, step 1 was documenting in your non-point source management plan. Step 2 were the 2 flows that explain how to make that scientific justification for source water protection in a 9-element plan. So if you finish step 1 and you finish step 2, that brings you to step 3. Most communities do not plan for the sake of planning. They plan so they can implement a plan and reach their water quality goals. And so in Nebraska, these plans are being written specifically so that they can be eligible for implementation funding through the 319 program. And once those plans are in place, they'll compete for those implementation funds from 319 at the state level. For 319 funds, most states will run an RFP or some sort of similar selection process to find projects that would be implemented. Your state non-point source website or contact can provide more information on those things. And just remember, when you're Googling to find who that might be in your state, remember that state non-point source programs go by lots of names. It may not always have 319 in the name. In summary, I'd just like to commend our colleagues in the state of Nebraska for the approach that they've taken. They've spent a lot of time on the front side to document their need for source water protection, the priority of that source water protection, and their justifications for targeting $319 to do some of that work that they're going to be doing. And the goal of all of those planning efforts, all of that work on the front side, is to make implementation go smoothly and to achieve those results as efficiently and practically as we can. And so we at Region 7 are supportive of those efforts and goals, and we're really excited to see how those Nebraska projects develop. And with that, Deirdre, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ryan and Heather. So if I could just remind everyone to keep typing in their questions and we will run through them. I put the contact information for each of the speakers and myself and as a website up here on the slide so that you'll have that. If you'd like to go back, we can also provide that for you via email. And what I want to do first is just ask a clarifying question of Heather. Since you just spoke, you had on a couple of your slides about the watershed planning process and the I&E to make it happen. Can you just clarify for us what I&E means?
Absolutely. That would be that outreach that Ryan's talking about. I&E is information and education. In reality, it's the outreach you do to implement the plan, whether it's shaking hands with local farmers, meeting in the coffee shop to try to sell them practices, BMPs, or whether it's the things that you put on a Facebook page or put in the local newspaper. All of that kind of gets grouped as I&E, information and education, and is a component of 9-element watershed plans.
Great, thank you. And then I will go back to a question for Nevada, and that is, do you have any components of your project, and I believe this was when you were talking about the Washoe project, that are relating to wastewater or groundwater replenishment, or as part of your on-site management resource planning?
I'm going to assume, Deidre, that the question is related to the water rights and aquifer storage and recovery. And at this point in time, that discussion has not been put on the table, although I know that locally that is something that the local community is looking at and moving forward with implementing.
As far as wastewater treatment, there is indeed a main wastewater treatment plant that is part of the TMDL as far as what their load allocation is for the TMDL. So that is a part of that component, and they are at the table. The Truckee Meadows Water Reclamation Facility, they are absolutely stakeholders, and they're at the table.
Great, thank you. And I think you used the term urban slobber. Somebody was just curious to how you define that.
Urban slobber, it's funny because whenever we give a presentation to boards, I think we use that term just to get them thinking because they often ask about it as well. Urban slobber is really anything that's coming off of the urban environment as a non-point source pollutant. And because we are in an arid environment here, a lot of our flows tend to be dryland flows, over irrigation, movement of fertilizers or pesticides into your storm drains. And we refer to that as urban slobber.
Great, thank you. Another question for Nevada. Is drinking water listed as a designated use of the Truckee River?
Yes.
All right, great. And then what is your greatest challenge in Washoe County in working with them there?
Our greatest challenge in Washoe County. Probably, this is Kim, and I'm going to speak from the freshwater protection standpoint, and I'll let Birgit address it from non-point source. But I think from freshwater protection planning, our greatest challenge is going to be overcoming political boundaries, I think, in the planning effort, and really bringing the communities together and finding tools, such as GIS tools and mapping, that will be compatible and congruent throughout the entire region.
And this is Birgit, and I'd just like to add in, I agree that that is a huge challenge. However, we have seen just amazing leaps and strides in how the stakeholders are coordinating and participating toward mutual benefits. I would also add in that in the West, Mark Twain said, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting over. And so water rights and distribution of water to those water rights holders actually legally trumps water quality, and that is a huge consideration that we need to focus on.
Great, thank you so much. And now I'm going to move to a question for Nebraska, and that is, were you calculating load reductions from surface water BMPs for the on the groundwater for the Basile plan? So sort of what is your maybe your process for looking at groundwater under the direct influence, or if it was in the Basile plan, for how that impacts your planning process?
Sure. On the Basile end, that's where we started, was looking at surface water load reductions. And, generally the BMPs that you're going to do for surface water and groundwater are pretty similar, but we did have to go through and do some of the research to figure out what that actually means to groundwater. And, groundwater is somewhat complicated when you add in that vadose zone. As Heather mentioned, there's just so much that goes on in there, and so much that isn't known, or, is still being researched out there, that, generally I think we have a pretty good handle on it, and we can generalize and say, yeah, this is good for the public water supply system. For their drinking water, this particular practice is good. But when you get down to the nuts and the bolts, and you ask the question, well, how good is it compared to this other practice? That's kind of where we struggled a bit. So we tried to do some ranges in there for those load calculations to figure that out. And then getting into the question about connected surface water, we're just getting into that with those 4 communities. 2 of them are under the influence, and we're actually kind of getting into the modeling end right now, and figuring out how do you model a conjunctive system like that that's on surface water and groundwater. How do you even show it to the public? Do you show it as 2 completely separate maps? Do you try to integrate them? How do you show the groundwater time of travels and then show this huge area that's influenced by the surface water? So I hope that helped to answer those questions.
Great, thank you. So also sort of related to that is, how do you decide if you've implemented enough for the lag time for groundwater up to the 50-year time of travel? Or maybe just to clarify how you calculated the time of travel.
Oh, sure. The time of travel is just based on groundwater flow, so it's not considering any vadose zone in that time of travel. We have thought about how do you look at the time of travel through the vadose zone, and we have some rough estimates, and specifically in Brazil we have a fairly decent handle of that, where that happened, but we haven't really looked at the time of travel through the vadose zone. But it's pretty rough, and it's a lot of estimates. Looking at other peer-reviewed research in the area with similar hydrologic areas.
So I just have, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and sorry, Laura's sitting here next to me feeding me some information. And yeah, the university is doing some research now, and I believe we're funding a little bit of that work through that Brazil plan, looking at some of those time of travels through the vadose zone. They're doing some coring up in that area and doing some, I forget the correct terms, they take the cores and they saturate them in water and wait how long it takes to get through there. So they are looking at some of that work.
So I just have a question myself, kind of related to that, but a little bit different in terms of, we've heard about how the nitrate levels sometimes it takes a long time to reduce them with the BMPs, and so I understand that you've calculated this long time of travel. Are you able to measure any of the improvements over certain periods of time? Are you expecting it to take a long time to show those improvements in some of your groundwater sources?
We are expecting to take it a long time. One of the examples that we used at a lot of these public meetings was an example that we have in a fairly shallow alluvial river system in the state. They started doing some management practices in the late 70s and early 80s, and it took them quite a few years to get over that hump. But hydrologically, that area is so much different than this. It responds much quicker to both bad things happening on the ground as well as good things. So in this area, we did we put in some dedicated monitoring wells, and there are some dedicated monitoring wells, and that's kind of the essence of what we're using to look here. The other thing that we looked at is I showed a tiered map area, and I talked a lot about the first 2 tiers, but the 3rd tier is an area where there was a trout rearing station that was a different shaded color there in that 3rd tier. They had some shallow monitoring wells there next to the stream, and that was more of a stream issue where the nitrates in groundwater, it was a gaining stream, nitrates in groundwater were degrading the stream, and they had some shallow monitoring wells and some deep monitoring wells close to that stream. And we dug through that data and found out that the nitrates got quite a bit better in those shallow monitoring wells, and then in fact we saw that correlation then in the stream. They went from, Laura's showing me the numbers here, 31 down to 18 in about 8 years. So we can have some effects there, but localized effects, and in shallow areas. Shallow systems are a lot easier to make headway on, in a timeable fashion compared with with deeper aquifers, thicker aquifers in different systems.
Okay, this is also for you there in Nebraska, and that is, can you explain a little bit more about making the case, maybe this is for Heather as well, making the case for the groundwater restoration in Bazille used in place of a 303D impairment listing?
Ryan, I can take a stab at that, and then if you want to add to it, that'd be great.
Perfect.
So the biggest thing to remember is that for most states, there are no designated uses for groundwater, at least not that are managed under like a Clean Water Act framework. And so calling groundwater impaired gets tricky because there's not a designated use that you're trying to maintain. And that's a lot of legalistic terminology from a Clean Water Act standpoint. The name of the game is that, you know, MCLs aren't quite the same as a water quality standard for surface water. And so some of that is a translation game between those two things. Ryan, do you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it pretty good.
Okay, and then a couple more questions for Nebraska. Do you have any public water systems that are served by springs?
We do have a few public water systems served by springs, or in my head, you know, what I define as a spring. And actually, one of those four that we're working on is technically, you know, in my head, what we would define as a stream. You know, it's a spring. It's a pipe buried, you know, in the side of a bluff there that water flows into. It's buried horizontally. You know, they treat for surface water, and they're considered surface water under the direct influence. Was that the whole question, Deirdre?
Yeah, they asked if you also had any reports on these, so I'm assuming that would be either some source water assessments or planning efforts going on those, in some of those springs.
We do. So, you know, most of those springs were initially, those sources were developed years and years ago, and that's probably mostly the reason that they're there. But from a quantity stance, they're working out pretty well. You know, recently, and I don't quote me on the dates, but, you know, 10 or 20 years ago, then when those surface water rules came into effect, they were required to treat for surface water. So there's some data that they collected, you know, when they went through that process. And then recently, the one that I just mentioned, system in Fairbury, Nebraska, and we're just starting to work on the planning effort there. And we'll be doing quite a bit of data collection there, installing some monitoring wells, and trying to get a handle on what's actually going on in the aquifer up gradient of that system.
Great, and then Ryan, this is also for you. Do you include water quantity impacts in the work you're doing to address water quality?
You know, we always have to work at it because quantity affects quality, and I think Heather would echo me here, hopefully. But you know, from a 319 perspective, you have to focus on the quality. But I think we've all come to the realization that the quantity does affect the quality, and that's why we have to look at it in some cases. In other cases, a lot of the projects that we're doing do have a side quantity component that the water systems are interested in. So as long as we're not directly paying through 319 funds for that quantity part, it's usually happens. And I think, you know, as an asset to both us, the 319 program, and the community itself. So.
Great, thank you. And again, this is another one for Nebraska. If maybe you could just describe a little bit about how your two programs, the source water program and the 319 program, are you know, organized within your state, because I have a question that says, how are you coordinating across the two programs. So I think it would be helpful to provide just a little bit of background about how you're organized there in the state of Nebraska.
Sure. So we're all in the same division. The one person now that does wellhead protection and source water stuff also does 319 projects, and most of the people that work on 319 projects help in some aspects one way or another with source water and wellhead protection. I used to be the wellhead protection coordinator several years ago and did 319 projects, and now I do a combination of both. So, you know, we're all in spitting distance of each other. We all talk to each other all the time. We can't, you know, it's hard to avoid each other. So we can hear people's conversations on the telephone when they're talking to other people. So, you know, I think just that proximity in the office has helped a lot. But, you know, once again, we do have a long history of program integration and people wearing multiple hats, meaning not just one person does one program. We usually try to cross-train and people actually doing multiple programs. So that's tended to benefit us, I guess, here in Nebraska, and we're looking at that.
Great, thank you. I think maybe it's important to point out here too that the drinking water program in Nebraska is actually in the health department, but the the Department of Environmental Quality is actually responsible for the source water protection and wellhead protection program. Did I say that correctly, Ryan?
Yes, that is correct. That is correct. And so they were, in the past, they've been a couple blocks away. You know, we worked quite a bit with the drinking water program. And recently, just a couple months ago, we actually co-located with them. So they're actually still the Department of Health, but they're on the same floor that we are. So they're, you know, maybe a 15-second walk away here from my office. So that's made collaboration a lot easier. And, you know, I really see the value, I guess, in being co-located and how much collaboration that helps.
Yeah, it sounds like Nebraska and Nevada both have that advantage in being co-located with your counterparts, and so that seems to have really helped your collaboration with these two particular programs. So that is great. And I want to stop here. We're at the time limit, and I just want to thank all of our speakers and everybody who participated and listened into the webinar. If you go to ASWA's website in the next few days, we will have the audio recording available, video and audio recording available for the webinar. If you have any follow-up questions, you can always email us. So again, thank you very much for your time today, and we really appreciate it. And with that, we will end the webinar.